Good evening, my friends. Welcome to another First Friday event sponsored by, once again, the Town of Woodside's Arts and Culture Committee. The committee is made of like-minded citizens of our community who want to promote interesting topics and subjects presented here at Independence Hall and the Town of Woodside. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this evening's very exciting and unique presentation. Now, some of you may not know, but I'm a trained cetologist, and that's a scientist who studies whales, dolphins, and porpoises, and that's where I spent most of my time. Now, this evening's presentation is by a good friend of mine, Mary Jane. And Mary Jane, as you will hear in her own introduction, has spent 40 years trying to help the environment of the ocean and the creatures that live in there. And so this evening we are very fortunate to have Mary Jane presenting to us. Now, Mary Jane is not with us live. She lives in Nevada. We're very fortunate to get her here on a brief passage to record this event for us. So I hope you sit back and enjoy it, and it's going to be an amazing ride. Thank you for being here.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming, and especially thank the Woodside Arts and Culture Club and Tom Johnson, the instigator for tonight's talk, for inviting me to share with you a remarkable tale of the sea. I truly wish I could be here in person tonight. Now, I've worked in marine conservation for over 40 years, and at the Marine Mammal Center, rescuing marine mammals ranging from tiny harbor seal pups to great whales, gray whales, sperm whales, even Humphrey the humpback whale 2 times. Later on, I worked for Oceanic Society expeditions, managed vessel-based eco-tours, and had some wonderful adventures at sea with them. And then for the last 20 years, worked with the NOAA's Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. Just retired fairly recently, but among these 3 enterprises, so basically for the last 40 years or so, I've pretty much been involved in marine conservation, hands-on wherever possible, and want to share with you a special story about one of those adventures. So tonight's story is about an encounter in fall of 1997, when 2 apex predators of the ocean came face-to-face in the waters just off San Francisco. It was an encounter that answered a very long-standing question. If a killer whale were to encounter a white shark in a battle essentially of brains and brawn, which of the 2 would emerge the victor? So that question was answered more or less on this particular day, and but the curious nature of the encounter itself, just because of the odd nature of the players, and its aftermath, have raised many, many more questions. So first, a disclaimer. Some of the images that I'll show you are from that day, with permission from the photographers. And unfortunately, some are blurry because things were happening really fast. The seas were very, very rough. And some people were too seasick, actually, to hold a camera, and it might have been unsafe to do that. So what I've done is I've augmented some of the presentation with other imagery, and I think essentially that'll help tell the tale. It was really odd that of the 40 some odd people aboard the boat that day, now this was pre-iPod or iPod days, there was no plethora of people on board with camcorders. Except this one tourist from England, and he was shooting in a different format. So we even had to convert that before we could share that with our scientists. So I've incorporated these other images, and that'll flesh out the story, but we'll let the events of the day speak for themselves. So this was the location. I'm showing you the Farallon Islands National Wildlife Refuge is the area marked with the X. And so we were making our way essentially from San Francisco, you can see that on the map, out to the islands. And this was our destination. The South Farallon Islands are world famous. There's 350,000 breeding seabirds out there. The white sharks visit there every fall to feed. 5 different species of pinnipeds haul out regularly there, and pinnipeds are seals and sea lions. And altogether, it's a marvelous place, but it's a very challenging area to get out to. It's just about a 2.5 hour cruise out of San Francisco, but it can be kind of rough. But the diversity and just the sheer abundance of wildlife makes it a very special place to visit. So now the islands themselves are surrounded by the protected waters of the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, which is over 3,000 square nautical miles of protected area. So this is one of the reasons why we don't see oil derricks and things off our shores. The islands themselves are protected, and the seas surrounding them are protected. So it's a perfect bed and breakfast, essentially, for many of the different wildlife species, the prey and the predators that are out there. So we have like seals and sea lions that haul out to sleep and rest after feeding forays at sea, and we have white sharks that go there to hunt these seals and sea lions as they approach the islands to do their hauling out. The birds are there pretty much year-round, but this is major nesting season right now during the spring and summer, where we do have those huge numbers of seabirds. So the whales and dolphins are also, a big attraction for people to come out. And the particular day that I was out there, I was on assignment with Cascadia Research to do photo ID on blue whales and humpback whales that come here to feed during the late spring and fall and midsummer months as well. So this is an example. We've got the blue whale on the left side of the screen surfacing right in front of the islands. At the bottom, a humpback breaching, and then the upper right, we've got a humpback whale that is lunge feeding, so it's plunging upward through the water to grab huge mouthfuls of prey, and you can see the birds surrounding it, trying to take advantage of the event. These are some of the other denizens of the deep that we find there: salmon, jellies, rockfish, whatever. It's a great fishing destination too. So the particular white shark population of the Farallones is unique in that we've got mainly adult and subadult animals. Those are animals of breeding age that hunt in these waters, and we don't believe they breed out there, but they do spend a couple of months during the fall months essentially banking calories. So as you probably know, they can reach up to 20, maybe even 21 feet in length and weigh up to 5,000 pounds. And some of the females, when they're gravid, when they're pregnant, they can actually be like 8 feet across. So they are massive animals. Apex predator, top of the food chain, and there are very few parts of the world's ocean where you actually can sustain apex predators like the white shark, like the great whales, whose photos that I just showed too, because of the sheer amount of food that they demand. So it's a very special place. But these white sharks also, they represent, because they're breeding stock, they represent the future generations of white shark pretty much throughout the eastern North Pacific. And so the sanctuary itself, which is part of NOAA, they've implemented some regulations against too close attraction or too close approach of the white sharks, so they can go about their business while they're out there during the fall. Now, the seals and the sea lions disagree with those protections, but then again, we're talking nature, red in tooth and claw at times. So now, white sharks play a very important role in the marine ecosystem. They balance it out. We've got a number of, like elephant seal, the youngest one especially, you see in the center of the page. And that's one of the favorite seal meals that the white sharks come here to enjoy. They're very naive. They don't really have good defensive survival skills. They've been at sea feeding for months and months, so they're blubbery butterballs of seal. We've also got sea lions and fur seals out there, but the white sharks they definitely come here for that particular purpose. So now, their populations are doing quite well. So that's one reason that the white sharks play that important part in balancing the ecosystem, because otherwise we might have more seals and sea lions than would be sustainable, and we would have greater mortality than we do currently. And we also might have a lot fewer salmon, and I think that would be tragic. So the seals and the sea lions are, as they approach the islands, the researchers that are out on the islands are, in the past, at the time of this attack, they were observing from Lighthouse Hill, which is about 300 feet up on the Farallones. So it's a perfect laboratory, really, for them to be able to look down at the perimeter of the islands and see the white sharks attack as they occur. Fog sometimes shrouds their visibility, but it happens on a very regular basis, starting at the beginning of October, basically going through the end of December. Some days there are multiple predation events, which it's a term they prefer instead of kill, and other days they see no action at all. So it's very important, though, that they keep that ongoing research to know what the feeding habits and foraging habits are of the white sharks out there.
Hey guys, this is Matt McIntosh for the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. I'm here on the Bayless. This is a sailboat, and it transports a skiff back and forth from San Francisco to the Gulf of the Farallones. For researchers, what they do is try to tag great white sharks, and the way they do that is they cut out of carpet a figure that looks like a seal. That piece of carpet also has a GoPro attached underneath it, and that way they can view the sharks that are coming up towards it. And it lays on top of the ocean.
But, you know, back, shark up. But it's always good for us to get video of her as she's swimming around. We can get an idea if she has new scrapes or marks, things that may be indicative of what they're doing here.
That's it. Sign out. Hope you enjoyed. See ya.
You know, we're lucky enough to be out here and to see a couple sharks. It's been great. But, you know, back, shark up.
My name's Scott Anderson, and I've been studying the white sharks out here for over 25 years. And we're mainly doing a photo ID study, but we've applied a lot of acoustic and satellite tags to these sharks.
I think the biggest misconception of people in our understanding of sharks is that people are seeing them as this sort of mindless killer. But what we found through the research that we've done is that they're actually these incredibly complex animals. They are here on the coast to feed, but they have a very specific feeding strategy where they're at the bottom, they're looking up, and they're very discerning in what they come for.
A lot of times you just can't see them. They're really cryptic. The coloration on their back, and unless they're right there, you can't see them.
And they are, I mean, they're super cautious. I think this giant predator, they're just jump in and out of the water. They really are cautious. They like to know what they're getting into. Like you'll see that they'll swim around the decoy a bunch of times before they usually come up. We got one shark up, kind of coupled to the decoy that we didn't see, but it'll probably be on the camera, so it's a good day.
Now the male white sharks, they show up every year like clockwork. They seem to be creatures of habit. They hang out in pretty much the same places around the islands, and the females, though, only come every year and a half, or every 2 years, sorry. And they presumably spend the rest of that time in lower latitude, warmer waters, where they're giving birth to their pups. So we only see them in alternate years. They're very slow to reproduce. Males don't even reach sexual maturity till they're about 26 years of age, and the females even later at about 33 years of age before she can produce any offspring. So now over the course of the few months that they're here, they may successfully feed on maybe 3 to 5 seals or sea lions, and hunting them is not an easy matter. I showed an earlier slide that says stealth is a really good strategy when you're going after the larger of the pinnipeds, and because the sea lions are fast and agile, they're very good swimmers. They literally swim underwater, and they have tricks for getting onto the islands and getting through that hot zone where the sharks lurk. Sea lions will very often go porpoising along the surface to get into the rocky intertidal area and up to safety. Elephant seals tend to sink down to the seafloor because white sharks tend to stay fairly far down in the water column and look up for that right silhouette to attack. And instead, it's easier for elephant seals to elude them altogether by just kind of skimming that seafloor, and then just as the islands arise, very abruptly haul out on the edge. So let's see. The kill is not always quick, and it's not always certain. So it's very important that the white sharks do remain unperturbed, undisturbed, while they're going about hunting their prey. And again, that is one reason why the Farallon Sanctuary has instituted some prohibitions against too close approach and attracting them. So now what the seals and sea lions represent to the white sharks is essentially a big calorie bank. And because the white sharks will be going out roughly 1,000 miles to an area just about halfway between northern Baja California and Hawaii. And that's an area where we're not certain what they do out there. We think they may be mating out there because the white shark males engage in this very sharp repetitive V dives that go very, very deep, maybe to even 1,000-foot depths. And the females don't seem to share that same behavior. So these could be demonstrations of how fit they are as a breeding partner, or maybe they're just more enterprising at scouting for prey out there. There are no big seals or sea lions out there, so the calorie bank out there is pretty slim, but there are a lot of cephalopods, so squid, octopus, and other types of more gelatinous, not so much meaty, high-calorie animals as you find at the Farallones. But that calorie bank has to basically see them through, the one that when they sort of fueled up at the Farallones, that has to see them through the next fall season when they come back to revisit us. So let's see, and that area is called the White Shark Cafe, and it's just something that's been discovered in the last 5 or 6 years or so, that they've really been able to have some pretty good research on exactly what happens out there. All right, so the Farallones white sharks have traditionally been the uncontested apex predator around the islands. Now, there are killer whales, the Biggs killer whales, which are also the transients. They're called transients. They're the meat hunters, and they do also hunt seals and sea lions in the general region. But for some reason, they seem to have avoided the Farallon Islands. So for many, many years, killer whale sightings at the Farallones were extremely rare. So it may have been some sort of a gentleman's agreement that they had come to, like an uneasy peace between two major big species, very toothsome and jawsome, not to interfere with each other's predatory habits. There are plenty of seal haul-outs along the California coast, and you do see the killer whales cruising along those areas. So now there's some history on the Farallon Islands shark research. It was at the Farallones that the West Coast white shark research began in the late 1980s, when Point Blue Conservation Science researchers Scott Anderson and Peter Pyle began doing a watch during the fall from Lighthouse Hill. And they studied their behaviors, the biology, and they also began to catalog individually recognizable white sharks out there. And so they were able to get information on their life history parameters, how often they bred, did they hang out together, did they have like running buddies, or were these just solo in their habits? And they were able to track their migration. They attached satellite tags and other types of technology to track where they go and what they did while they were there, and what the water conditions and other environmental factors were in these other habitats that they visited. Then later, the Monterey Bay Aquarium and Stanford University joined in the research, and the series of collaborations taken by these various organizations has been extremely successful, and it's led to a much deeper understanding of what these creatures need to survive. So as I mentioned before, the protective legislation, and other legislation could be required, but it's doubtful. I think now so many people have become aware that white sharks are not just special in their own right, but they're to be respected. So as far as like cage diving, that is something that needs to be done under permit, just as the research is being done under permit, and with certain controls in place. Now, parallel with the white shark research that I just described, we've got killer whale research that's been going on, again, since the 1980s. And it's been primarily focused in Monterey Bay. Someone called Nancy Black, a biologist, and Alyssa Schulman-Janiger. The two of them have been primarily putting together a catalog of the killer whales in the general region. And Alyssa Schulman-Janiger, she lives in Southern California, so she's especially familiar with the groups of killer whales that frequent that area, very specifically the what's called an LA pod, and these are a unique group of these bigs or transient killer whales that have several unique characteristics that you'll learn about very shortly. But the three different ecotypes of killer whales that we have all together throughout the California coast are the bigs killer whales, that are the transients that eat seals and sea lions, the meat eaters. Then we have the offshore types that are relatively little studied, but they usually are found a greater distance from shore, but also they feed on smaller sharks and skates and rays, as well as squid and some other deeper water fish. And then we have the southern residents, which are a fairly new phenomenon, and those killer whales actually came down here from the Puget Sound area near Seattle and the Salish Sea, and because there's so little salmon left up in the Pacific Northwest, they have to migrate these many hundreds of miles down to our waters in order to feed adequately. And the southern resident group is very close to being extinct. That it's a subgroup that is very much in danger of disappearing because of many different environmental pressures. So then we had an orca. Now the size difference. First of all, the killer whales, they're pretty much found in all oceans of the world, and they're heavyweights. They weigh up to about 11 tons or so, and they measure up to roughly 32 feet. They're technically dolphins. They're the largest member of the dolphin family, and the males are larger than the females, and there's also a distinct difference in the size and shape of the dorsal fin. The males have these very prominent, sometimes 6-foot-high dorsal fins, and they have an incredibly long lifespan, up to 90 years, so possibly longer than that. So they're definitely another really intriguing species. Now, let's see. This will be another video. Now, on this particular day, I had come aboard the boat to photo-identify the blue and humpback whales for Cascadia, and our plan was to cruise around the Farallon Islands and see the wildlife that was on the shores, the seals and sea lions and seabirds. And during the fall, actually, there are quite a few migratory seabirds, so there's always a different complement, a different wildlife profile out there. And after the islands, sea conditions permitting, because it was beginning to be a little bit of a rough day, we had hoped to head offshore to deeper waters in search of albatross and the bigger whales, the blue whales especially, the big game, because blue whales tend to feed on a very restricted diet of krill, which are tiny shrimp-like crustaceans, and you may or may not find those krill near shore, but you pretty much always will find it near the edge of the continental shelf, roughly 35 miles out. So we didn't expect to see on this particular day either white sharks or killer whales. We were after the other species. And whites are elusive anyway. They're a very cryptic ambush predator. They patrol deep underwater, sometimes as deep as 90 feet. And again, they look for that silhouette on the surface to determine whether there's a seal or a sea lion, some likely target to attack. And this made the likelihood of our seeing one even slimmer on one of these regular whale watch cruises. So instead, we focused our attention, we thought we would be focusing our attention on Fisherman's Bay at the Farallones. But while we were headed out, the captain received a radio call from one of the party boats who reported that he had seen 2 killer whales hanging around the Farallon Islands, and that was around, I think about 10:15 or so. And then about half hour later, we got a call from another fishing boat near the Farallon saying, we just saw 2 killer whales, and they just killed and partly ate a large California sea lion. So we were very excited about this. We pretty much dropped our plans and just rewrote the day's itinerary. And Captain Mick of the new Superfish, he pretty much kicked the boat into overdrive, and we headed out very directly to the location that the last party boat had reported. And so as we approached the islands, we searched for the orcas or for some group of excited birds or something like that might indicate that there was a kill that had just happened there. Those are very often our first signs of detecting action. And Mick immediately had radioed the researchers up on the Farallon Islands to let them know that something really interesting was happening between the killer whales and a sea lion, and being white shark season and these guys being white shark scientists, they might want to come down and have a look. So what we were doing is we had located the 2 killer whales, and the boat was at idle. We were off in an area near a spot called Sugarloaf, and we were on the sort of like the northwest side of southeast Farallon Island, and that's unfortunately an area where it's the windward side of the island, so we had pretty good oncoming seas, pretty good swell that day. The winds were Beaufort 3 and 4, as I recall, and they were getting brisker. But we had these 2 killer whales that literally swam right up to our boat. And so naturalist Carol Kuiper was giving a little talk about the rarity of this kind of sighting. And I was sitting up on top of the wheelhouse roof with the deckhand, and we were scouting around for the dead sea lion to see if that was somewhere in the area and see if there would be any further feeding going on. And as Laura and I sat there and we're scanning, everybody else is looking at the killer whales, we looked straight down, and at one point we saw this huge dark shape skimming by, tightly hugging the side of our vessel from port, from the starboard side bow down to the stern of the vessel. And so immediately the 2 of us were thinking white shark, and she made the call. And what was interesting, though, is that the white shark seemed to be completely oblivious that the 2 killer whales were just literally more than half a vessel length away from it. So what happened was that as we were sitting there, because we were getting ready to scramble down, we saw the white shark make an immediate detour, roughly 45 degrees angle away from the vessel. And it proceeded on that course for several minutes. And about 15 minutes later, and this is having given the white shark a bit of an lead time, one of the killer whales broke off the milling behavior that they'd been engaged in and went off on a course where she intercepted the white shark. And we didn't actually see, I think no one must have seen the actual point of contact because the seas were, pretty sloppy, and by that time they were both underwater. But it was amazing that for probably another 10 minutes at least, we saw no action. We saw no blood in the water. We saw no hovering gulls looking to feed on scraps or anything. And so we had to wait out what was happening. And then, much to our surprise, we kind of watched them we waited for about 20 minutes or so. And then, lo and behold, who's approaching the boat now, but it's one of the two killer whales, the smaller of the two, CA2. And she has a white shark in her mouth, and the white shark is motionless, and it's upside down. She's basically holding it kind of by its neck. So now I'm showing some photos here, CA2. You can see the fin with the unique markings on the fin, the notch near the base of it. And then also she has these birthmarks on her head. So she's been known to have those markings for many years. And also white scars on the muzzle, and a little bit of bloodiness was later seen on some of the underwater footage, indicates she's the one that actually did the kill. So now we have a bit of a size discrepancy. We've got killer whale CA2, who's the one who actually engaged with the white shark, and she was small for the size of an adult female killer whale. They're usually around 23 feet in average, and she was only about 15.5 feet to maybe 17.5 feet. The other killer whale that was with her was a few feet bigger. She was 17.5 roughly to maybe pushing 20, but not quite. And so at first we actually thought this might have been a mother and her daughter, because they are known, they're very social animals. They retain the family connection. But we found out a little bit different later that they both were adult females and apparently unrelated. And then we have our white shark, and the white shark itself was runty. He was small for the size of white shark that is ever seen out at the Farallones. So he was about 9 to 13 feet in length right there. So it was an interesting encounter. They weren't the biggest of the big of their type, but they were nonetheless pretty impressive representatives of their species. So at around 12:15, shark researcher Peter Pyle launched a small boat from the Farallon Islands, and he arrived on the scene where he found a large slick. And hundreds of seabirds were screaming and hovering and dipping down to grab pieces of shark. And he used a pole camera to record the orcas feeding on it underwater, especially targeting its very oil-rich liver. And the liver, it's very buoyant because of the oil, and it's also very valuable. It's essentially what they need, all those calories, to make their long-distance migration. So it had popped out, and the two of them were feeding on it at and below the surface. And so Peter's the one who was able to get some underwater, very valuable behavioral footage, and that was really great for the scientific world to see. And then at roughly 12:30, Scott Anderson, who was just arriving at the Farallon Islands for the beginning of research season that year, he saw them feeding and coming out in a separate boat, and he observed one of them, and we're not sure which one it was, raise its head out of the water and emit a loud squeal lasting about 2 or 3 seconds duration. What that was all about, we really don't know, but at about 12:36, both of the killer whales stopped feeding and they swam northward and weren't seen again that day. Now, one of the amazing things was that, just to back up a little bit, is that when we saw the killer whale CA2 come back with the white shark in her mouth, upside down, she actually carried it around our boat several times. It was as though she was doing victory laps. So I guess if you have the ability to show yourself, if you've got it, flaunt it, as the supreme beast of the sea, she did pretty well that day. And so I'm going to just pretend that she was the one who was sort of squealing her victory. Just seems to fit the pattern. So anyway, we didn't see any other white shark attacks that day, certainly. And clearly this was a coup, both for the killer whales and for the whale watchers on board the boat. Obviously not a coup for the white shark. Sorry about that. But it did seem to settle the question as to whether, who was going to be the master of the oceans in a face-off. So about CA2, once again, we're coming back to a member of, she and CA6 were both members of this strange group, this LA pod that lives primarily off the Los Angeles area, so Santa Monica Bay, Santa Barbara, in that general area. And there's a subgroup, they're not really, I guess they would be called a pod, but only of roughly 13 or 14 animals altogether. And what was really strange was that she'd been documented as early as, I think, 1982 off Mexico as an adult female then. And CA6, who was the larger other female, she was also documented from the 1980s off Mexico. So they have a history, but it was just odd that on this particular day, they came a lot further north than they had ever been seen before. So we don't really know what the reason was, what triggered that. And let's see. So we don't think CA6, who was the larger one, had any real role in the predation event itself. So now I did talk about, this was the clash of the titans. They weren't really all that big, but they were pretty impressive. The shark itself was 10 to 13 feet long, and I wouldn't want to go swimming with one that size. Plus, we pretty much consider that almost a juvenile. And juvenile white sharks, when they're born, they will spend most of their life in Southern California and Mexican waters, at least this particular population. And the waters are a lot warmer. They're more buoyant. Apparently, they feed on fish, so their body really has not yet adapted as they mature to feeding on a flesh diet. It's strictly fish. They even have specialized jaws that are more suitable for catching fish than the large white sharks that are seal and sea lion hunters. So they, at this roughly 10 to 13 foot size, they undergo this metamorphosis in a way. It's a change where their jaws become more calcified, more mineralized. Their teeth change in shape and form. They become serrated, more able to actually pin a chunk of flesh from a seal or a sea lion in place and actually do a sawing action in order to remove chunks of flesh from them. So pretty impressive set of choppers altogether. So we have heard now about this amazing encounter between the killer whales and the white sharks. And there were certain anomalies and questions that really kind of followed the whole event. It was over in a flash. I mean, things were very confused on board. Everybody was grabbing cameras or whatever, rushing to the other side of the vessel when the whales repositioned themselves. But what we were really looking to do was to take a look at what impact this particular attack had on the ecosystem. And that pretty much unveiled itself after a period of time. So those of us who were witnessed on board, we went ahead and we published in Marine Mammal Science a full account as far as we could recreate everything as to exactly what happened, what the timeline was, who the parties were, what the activities were. But we can't, it left a number of questions that we couldn't really answer, despite having seen as much as anyone saw. But we do know for certain that it was the first ever witnessed killer whale attack on a white shark. We don't know exactly how the white shark died. Was it rammed and killed that way by CA2? Is that how she got that sort of bloody scar on her muzzle or rostrum? Or did she grasp it and suffocate it somehow? Now, showing this one photo of the belly up white shark, it's a possibility that she put it into what's called a tonic immobility, which is essentially flipping an animal over so that its belly side is up. So some animals have a defensive behavior where they literally sort of play possum. So it's a version of that, and it's sort of the same behavior that allows daredevil alligator wrestlers in Florida to flip over alligators and rub their bellies for tourists or whatever. So now if the shark goes into this tonic immobility for too long, it's not able to move forward. It doesn't oxygenate its lungs with seawater, and because sharks need to move constantly in order to oxygenate themselves, their blood. So in this case, it may be that the animal was suffocated, so we don't know. Rammed, suffocated, or some combination of the two. And let's see, some of the other anomalies was the size of the white shark. What was it doing up here at such a small size? And who was the shark? And that question has never really been answered. It wasn't in the Farallon Islands catalog of white sharks of known individuals. And so maybe it was a new kid on the block. There was a book that was published sometime later claiming it was the shark named Jerry Garcia, but I personally don't know that, and that's not been borne out by any of the papers that I've seen. And then another question was what became of killer whales CA2 and CA6. So, and another question was, why did we have killer whales eating both a sea lion, which is meat, and a shark, which is fish, pretty much in the same afternoon? Because usually they pretty much stick to their diet of the ecotype that they belong to. They're either fish eaters or meat eaters. But again, this is the LA pod, which should probably be redubbed the Odd Squad pod, because they break all the rules. So, and let's see. So probably the most significant outcome of this particular event was the fact that after October 4th, 1997, the white sharks pretty much disappeared altogether from the Farallon Islands. Normally, there could be several attacks seen in a day by the researchers on the islands. In this case, I think there had been one prior attack the day before of a white shark on a seal or a sea lion, but then following this particular attack on the shark itself, there were no more. There was, I think, one seen the following day, which was believed to be just a regular little elephant seal. And then apparently all of the white sharks that would normally be staying around those waters through December, they bailed. They left for Tomales Bay. They shifted to the mainland, to another area where there were seal and sea lion rookeries. But they absolutely stayed away because the white shark researchers stayed on the island to just make sure, because the absence of a predator is equally important as noting the presence of a predator. They were able to verify that there were no further white shark attacks on seals or sea lions for the balance of that 1997 season. So that was very strange. And it was essentially a seismic upheaval within the food web. And then, of course, next year in the fall, 1998, the white sharks, having visited their place offshore, the White Shark Cafe off between Baja and Hawaii, they resumed their normal rate of predation on the seals and the sea lions. So there were two suspected later incidents that were not witnessed where killer whales were seen around the Farallon Islands, and the sharks disappeared all of a sudden and didn't come back for those seasons. One of them was very late in the season, though. It was in November, as I recall. So it could have been that the white sharks had pretty much wrapped it up by that time anyway. But the killer whales that were identified from those two later attacks were not CA2 and CA6. They were not members of that LA pod. So these were just the regular, presumably the meat eaters that were switching diets all of a sudden to fish. Okay. So, speaking of disappearances, like the LA pod managed to do, the research that goes on out at the Farallon Islands is very important. It goes on off Año Nuevo as well, but we really need to be keeping close track on these apex predators. And prior to COVID, the research had been funded by a number of different groups, and I've mentioned before collaborations with the Monterey Bay Aquarium and Stanford. And unfortunately, when COVID hit, a lot of research projects, including the marine sanctuaries, Fish and Wildlife Service, a lot of these came to a screeching halt, and funding was pulled from many of them. But Scott Anderson, who is the principal investigator, he's very determined. I mean, he has history with these white sharks going back to the 1980s. So these are sort of family and neighbors as far as Scott's concerned. And so he has established a nonprofit group, the California White Shark Project. And what they're doing now is they're doing the same kind of research, essentially. They're doing photo ID, they're doing some satellite tagging, but they're self-funding it for the most part. But they have established a nonprofit group. So he and his partner, Paul Kenivey, they're working together and trying to maintain that essential continuity in profiling the activities of the Farallones white sharks. So if anybody is interested in helping to support that research, their contact information is available. And that's pretty much it as far as the research. It's ongoing, and it's extremely important because everything is integrated within the marine ecosystem as it is with terrestrial ecosystems. And maintaining the integrity of those apex predator populations is as important as maintaining virtually any other species. So, and I do want to acknowledge many different people for the different images and the content that they've provided to me. And Scott Anderson and Paul Kenivey especially, but a number of different agencies and groups have been very generous in lending their imagery, some of their videos and such. And but I do, before I go, want to introduce a very special shark, and that's a shark named Tom Johnson. Tom Johnson the shark, who was first cataloged in the White Shark Catalog for the Farallones in 1987. And he is still a regular visitor to the Farallon Islands and to Año Nuevo. So special thanks to Tom Johnson, the human, for helping to put tonight's presentation together. Thank you.
D.H. Lawrence perhaps said it best when he wrote in his poem, "They say the sea is cold, but it contains the warmest, hottest blood of all." And he was in referencing to whales, especially great whales. And this evening, you have heard a fascinating and unique experience about two titans who met at the Southeast Farallon, just 26 miles off our coast here. And one had to be the victor. And as you saw, that victor was Ursinus orca, the killer whale. So I hope you enjoyed that experience. I hope you learned something about the fascinating world that lives right off our coast here. And perhaps if you get a chance, you might venture out to the Farallon someday on one of the many ships that take visitors out to explore the area around the island and enjoy that experience. Be prepared, because you never know what you will find out there. Because as E.E. Cummings said, no matter what you lose, like a you or a me, it's always yourself you find at the sea. Thank you again. We look forward to seeing you next month.